Alright, what's up YouTube? As today, per a subscriber's request, I am going to make this Spider-Man web shooter. And I made this with some 5mm EVA foam. I painted it with an airbrush. I used a aluminum shank that I ground down with a Dremel from a wrist brace that I got at the thrift store. And everything else I just made out of junk I had lying around the house, etc. So yeah, let's go ahead and get into the video. Okay, to make these web shooters, I'm going to use some 5mm and 3mm EVA craft foam. I have some of this stiff foam boarding here that is actually just going to be used for the web cartridges, so I don't have to seal the foam. All I have to do is just paint this. And for the actual button in the palm and the center thing, I was going to make it out of foam, but I was at the thrift store and I found this wrist guard. Brand is Mueller. And the reason why I got the wrist guard is it had this inside. This is aluminum. So what I'm going to do is, and as you can see, this fits great into my hand. And this will be much more sturdy in the long term, say, than anything I make like foam or plastic or Warbler or anything like that. Or thermoplastic for that matter. This is going to be pretty heavy duty. But I am going to have to take the Dremel and I'm going to cut out this outside edge and around this circular part. Not for the whole thing, but probably from here up. I'm going to trim all this edge off on both sides. And some of the other stuff I've gathered to make this is these little screw toppers that I'd cut up, just random other little pieces to make the actual buttons themselves in the center. And I also have a chrome pen cap that is going to act as the actual web shooting spot, which is nice too because I don't have to paint it. It's already chrome plated. Alright, and the first thing I'm going to do is take my Dremel and start trimming all this off. Just to take a second here, I can't stress enough the importance of using safety gear. Anytime you're painting, sanding, grinding, or cutting on anything, or even using glue, you want to make sure that you have a respirator and you're in a well-ventilated area. And since I'm going to be using the Dremel, I'm also going to be wearing safety glasses. Alright, I got all the excess trimmed off, and it's just a rough trim. And looking at the back here, you can see, I wanted to actually follow this line here on both sides. So a little more trimming and sanding and grinding here, and a little less here. And a whole lot more to make this circular and get all that excess metal flashing cut off there. And the first thing I'm going to do is use this grinding tip and start to roughly grind away some of the excess. Alright, now that most of the rough grinding is all done, it's pretty much got the shape, but it's not 100% there. But for the last little bit, I'm going to use this one right here to get some of the corners and such and help round out some of the small areas. Then I'm going to hit it with the sanding wheel. Alright, I've worked out all the little kinks in it, and it's pretty good. But for the edges and everything, I'm going to go over them with 100 grit, and then I move on to a 300 grit sanding block, and finally I'm going to use 600 grit to sand the whole thing by hand. Alright, so next you're going to need to make a pattern of your arm. And to do this, you need to wrap your arm in something. It doesn't really matter what it is to a certain point. I've used paper, I've used like old trash bags, grocery bags, whatever, plastic wrap. You're going to want to wrap it up so it looks like this here. Get your whole arm covered, and next you're going to take duct tape and you're going to want to tape it up so that it looks something like this. And next I'm going to cut this, and I'm probably going to cut it along this top edge here to get it off. I'd like to make it so that I can just slip it on one side and Velcro it together. My pattern and trace it out onto some 5mm thick EVA foam. And I did make the pattern larger. Not larger this way, but larger this way. Just because whenever you fold the EVA foam, it doesn't always fit you the same way, say, as like a paper duct tape pattern will, just because it's thicker. And the other thing is, if it's a little bit too big, you can always trim some off. But if it's too small, you're either stuck with a huge gap or you're stuck starting over. Also keep in mind, if you're putting this over a costume, you need to account for that as well. So you may want to at least try the part on with your arm to make sure that it fits. Alright, so I heated the foam up with the heat gun and then just gradually worked into the shape of my wrist. And I decided to have the cut in the enclosure on the inside part here of my arm, just so that I could easily take it on or off if I need to. On the outside it's going to be a little bit harder. And from here, the only thing I'm going to do is look at my reference photos and decide if I like the length or if I want to trim it a little shorter or if there needs to be some curvature or whatever to it. I'm going to do a whole bunch of final adjustments and cuts right now. So to give it more of a Spider-Man homecoming shape, I took and cut this corner here out and then flipped it over and traced it for the curve on this side, and then cut that around to make sure it matched up, and that is going to be on the bottom with my web shooter going on here. Alright, I went through and did something similar with the top, and next you can see I drew the outline of my piece here, and I'm going to go ahead and scuff the back of this up with some extremely rough grit sandpaper. I'm going to use some super glue and some hot glue, and I'm going to go ahead and glue this, center it up on here, and glue it on. This has all been glued on, and I'm happy with it. It conforms really well to the shape of my wrists. And next, since all this other stuff is done, what I've done is I took and just kind of freehand drew out what I wanted the piece that's going to go on the top here, which will have the web cartridges and stuff in it. But I really needed two of them, one on each side, with a connector between the two here. So I took this and made sure everything fit. And then I took and traced out a pattern where I put one here and then flipped it over and traced out another one with a space joining it. And what I got was this. And I took and heated it and shaped it. And now I'm going to use some super glue and glue this onto the top of this. Alright, now that that's glued on in the spot where I want it, the next thing I have to do is I need to start filling all this in. And I'm going to work from the back up. And the reason for that is I have to put in the web cartridges, I believe they are, that holds the actual material which gets ejected out of here whenever this button is depressed, the webbing. And to do that, I have some EVA foam mat here. Just some scraps from some EVA floor mats, and they're a little thicker. This one came in a 6-foot long roll, and I'd say this is at least 8mm thick, if not closer to 10. But what I really need is a scrap piece that I cut off here that I'm going to glue in here, just like that. And on top of this, I'm going to glue my two little square pieces that are going to be the ends of the web cartridges. And when I'm all done, those are going to be painted a bright red. Alright, so I glued in another piece of the scrap foam mat up here. And on top of these two, what I glued was two squares of the EVA foam mat And the two pieces that I showed you from the beginning of the video that I cut out that are just the, you could use EVA foam, but I decided to use this, I think it's called foam craft board, but it's just like, it's almost like cardboard on the outside, but there's a layer of foam in between. And you'll notice I glued these in at a slight angle to one another just because that's how it looks in the reference photos. And next I'm going to make the little bridge piece that goes over top here. Alright, next I took some more of this EVA foam floor mat and I cut a couple squares out of it, and I ended up sanding down and chopping off as much of this as I could to get it as even as possible. Then I glued those two squares one on top of the other, and I took the side that was the most flush, which was here, to be the front, and I measured it wide enough that it's going to fit down inside here and slide under the bridge piece I made. And I made this out of 3mm EVA foam. I literally just cut a strip about 1 inch wide and figured out where the bends went, heated it, bended it, glued it on. And this is going to go underneath. But to get this to the proper shape that I want, you can see I already took and hacked at it a little bit with some scissors. This is just so I remember where and how I want the angles. And to get this exactly how I want, I'm going to use a Dremel and sand it down. Alright, now that I got the edges roughly sanded down to the shape I want, I will go back through and hand sand this and even it out. But before I do all that, I need to go through here in the middle now and put a groove in it so that I can put my pen cap down in there to act as the actual nozzle which would dispense the webbing. Okay, and there's the groove where my nozzle, my chrome pen nozzle, will glue in. And I even put it in at an angle to compensate for the fact that, you know, the pen cap is pointed. Alright, I went ahead and glued in with some super glue the piece that I sanded and shaped. And at the end of everything, once I paint it, that's what I was talking about with the pen cap, we'll go down into that space there. And that's why I also say I kind of grind it inwards to account for the angle of it so it would sit nice and straight. So you have a good looking chrome plated web shooter. Alright, I squirted some hot glue down in there and I shoved a couple scrap pieces of EVA foam in there just to cover up the actual aluminum and to make it a little closer to your little spider web clips. And I also rough cut a piece and just kind of glued it in here with some super glue and set it with some hot glue to cover up this bottom part. Next, what I'm going to do is use a dime and a folded piece of paper and make a pattern for the center stripe that's going to go down through here. And what I mean by making a pattern with a penny is I folded a piece of paper in half, I centered up a penny on it, I traced around it and drew out a line. I cut it out, and then whenever I open it up, I will have the pattern for the piece that will run down the center of this. And I'm going to go ahead and trace this onto some 2mm EVA craft foam and then cut it out. Alright, I've got my pattern all cut out and glued on here. And next, what I've done is I've drawn some lines on here kind of crudely. Initially I thought about doing an overlay with 2mm thick EVA foam, but I decided against it. I didn't want to make this any bulkier than what it already is. I want it to be streamlined. I mean, this is Spider-Man we're talking about here. So what I've decided to do is I've drawn these lines on. I'm going to very meticulously carve them in using a hot knife. Or a wood burner, whatever you want to call it, but I'm going to go ahead and cut those in now. And I've gone through and cut all the lines and stuff into it with the wood burner. I did use some sandpaper to help even this up. And just do a little bit more. I'm going to take the Dremel and a pointed grinding tip and go through and just smooth it out a little bit more. Alright, now that everything is the way I want it, and I'm pretty happy with it, I'm going to seal it. But before I seal it, I am going to put some Velcro right in here. I'm just going to use some super glue and glue it in. Alright, the Velcro is attached. and I did most of the sanding, and it feels pretty good and fits pretty good on my wrist. And next what I'm going to do is seal the entire thing with some gloss Mod Podge and a paintbrush. Some of the things I'm not going to seal is any parts of the cartridge itself that holds the webbing, and the aluminum. I am not going to put any of that on there. Alright, I brushed on a pretty liberal amount of the Mod Podge, and now that that's dried, I'm going to go ahead and fire up my air compressor here, and I'm going to airbrush this with some opaque black that I'm going to mix with some 40-30 mix additive. It's just a water-based polyurethane. And I'm going to add in a little bit of this glazing medium. This isn't actually for airbrushing, but once you thin it out and mix it really good, it works pretty good. And this helps it to come out looking more glossy and less flat. And with this particular brand of Creatix Black, it does look a little flat, and I'd like this to be glossy. Okay, you can see here that I painted the little ends of the webbing cartridges red, and I just used some dark red acrylic craft paint. It's pretty inexpensive, but it did take about 4 coats to get a nice even solid color on it. But to make it pop a little more, I want it to be a little glossy, so I'm going to put some of this glazing medium on it. Alright, with just that little bit of glazing medium, you can see it's got a nice gloss shine now that really does match the black. And next I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use this stuff that's called Model Masters. That's the name of the brand. And this particular color is silver chrome, and I'm going to use that to pin the rest of the web cartridges and the other silver accents on this. Alright, it's all painted up. Now I'm going to just go ahead and glue that chrome plated pen cap in, and I'm going to go ahead and glue that in with some hot glue. Alright, now that I got my cap glued in here, this is pretty much all done and ready for me to try on. Alright, so it fits really nicely. I still have a little bit of room that if I were to wear a costume under it, I could. I'm happy with the way this came out overall. It fits the curvature of my arm and my hand quite nice. Of course, like I say, this is aluminum, so it's quite sturdy. And yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video and it gave you some ideas for your own projects. And if you like this video, please like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.